Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll just give it a few more seconds for people to get logged in. If you could put in the chat where in on the Oregon coast or from elsewhere you're joining us from tonight, that would be great. And we'll see where our geographical spread is. All right. I see a few more people trickling in. So we'll get started. If you missed it, people are putting in the chat where they are joining us from. So feel free to drop your location if you'd like. All right. Oh, Texas or Dallas, Oregon. All right, well, we'll get started. Thanks for joining us for the fall return of our Oregon Beaches Forever webinar series. Tonight, I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Sally Hacker. But first, I will tell you a little bit more about Surfrider and about the Oregon Beaches Forever campaign. So my name is Kaya Hazard. I'm the Oregon Regional Manager for the Surfrider Foundation. Surfrider is a nonprofit group. We work in coastal states nationwide, and we work on a range of initiatives to protect our ocean and coastline. In Oregon, these range from monitoring water quality to fighting against plastic pollution through beach cleanups and progressive policy, and making sure that Oregon's public beach remains accessible. So, to that end, Surfrider has teamed up with Oregon Shores to launch our Oregon Beaches Forever campaign. As many of you know, Oregon's beaches are threatened by the coastal squeeze between coastal development and the armoring built to protect it on one side, and on the other by sea level rise and climate change. So, through the Oregon Beaches Forever campaign, we'll be taking a more holistic approach to protecting our beaches. And of course, we will continue to oppose shoreline armoring along our coast, as we know the harmful effects that it has on our public beaches. But we'll also be advocating for local level climate adaptation and improved shoreline management and the implementation of nature-based erosion solution model projects and policies that promote beach preservation and climate adaptation. And we'll be working with state agencies on their rulemaking processes to update and improve existing regulations for shoreline armoring, permitting, and access to and along the shoreline. So, if you'd like to learn more about this campaign and stay up to date with upcoming educational events like this one, for example, we'll be having more webinars, two more webinars to finish out the year. You can find information on both the Surfrider or the Oregon Shores websites, and I will drop that link into the chat shortly. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar tonight, please drop those in the chat or into the Q&A box, and we will get to those at the end. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mandy at Oregon Shores.
Thanks so much, Kaya. Hello, everyone. My name is Mandy Watson. I am the Coastal Conservation Manager with Oregon Shores. In case anyone isn't familiar with Oregon Shores, we're a nonprofit and we focus on coastal and ocean issues all up and down the coast here in Oregon. Our vision is a healthy and resilient Oregon coast where people and nature thrive together. And we do this by educating and empowering people to protect coastal ecosystems and coastal communities. We do this through kind of two main avenues, policy advocacy and education and outreach. We're probably most widely known for our Coast Watch program, where people adopt a mile of the coast to monitor changes and contribute to a statewide citizen science project. But we also have a really strong policy advocacy team, which we do everything from influencing land use decisions and shoreline planning decisions with our Oregon Beaches Forever team at Surfrider, to lobbying for coastal habitat protections at the state legislature, to preventing bad development on Oregon's estuaries, beaches, and dunes. And for more information on how to get involved with Oregon Shores or more information in general, feel free to visit our website. Today, we are super lucky to have Dr. Sally Hacker. Sally is a professor at Oregon State University, where she has been a faculty member since 2004. Her research explores the structure, function, and services of natural and managed coastal ecosystems, including rocky intertidal, estuarine, and coastal dune habitats. Her most recent work focuses on the role of coastal dune plants in building dunes and mitigating coastal hazards. In addition to the textbooks Ecology and Life, The Science of Biology, she is an author or co-author on numerous articles and book chapters exploring themes in coastal ecology. So thanks so much for being here today, Sally. Feel free to take it
Great.
away.
Thank you, Mandy and Kaya and Surfrider and Oregon Shores and those of you in the audience. Um, I'm going to talk about beachgrass invasions today and the kind of landscape level consequences that that original introduction has had to the Pacific Northwest coast. And I work with a team of people, so we do we collaborate together. Um, both, so I work with Peter Ruggiero, who's a professor at OSU in COS, Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, and also Megan Wengrove, who is a professor in civil and construction engineering. So I work with geomorphologists and engineers, and I'm the ecologist of the group. And we also have a number of amazing grad students who have contributed to the work that I'm going to talk to you about today. So I wanted to make sure to mention them. And then, of course, we need funding to do our work. And so we've been generously funded by NSF, by NOAA, by the Army Corps, by Sea Grant, and so forth. So just want to acknowledge them. So the Pacific Northwest is a really unique place, in part because nearly 50% of our coastline is backed by dunes and sandy beaches. And in fact, the largest dune sheet in North America occurs here in Oregon. So it's a really unique place and a really special place to study dunes and beaches. And obviously, this immense landscape was the inspiration for Frank Herbert, who wrote Dune, and in the late 1950s. And since then, there have been Dune movies recently, and there's been a lot of interest in our coastal dunes because of his book and because of the influence of um, his writing on popular culture, I guess. So I like to think about dunes as kind of having a past, a present, and a future. And so I'm going to organize my talk around those three themes. And so in the past, interestingly, our beaches and dunes were quite different than they are today. They were a very sparsely vegetated, kind of shifting, dynamic, open, sandy environment. Um, and that was prior to the 1900s. Um, this really dynamic system had some vegetation, but it was not nearly as vegetated as it is now with the introduction of beach grasses. And that native dune community, we think, included a diversity of different species that really thrived under this kind of open, sandy environment, although we actually know very little about the natural history of these systems. So, in terms of thinking about restoration, which I'll talk about at the end, we have to, you know, try to reconstruct what we think these communities used to be like. There's also a native dune grass that I want to mention. It's called Lamus mollis, and it's known as the American dune grass, and it's native to this region, um, and was also part of this community. So European settlement in the past was really hindered by sand mobility. This shifting sand environment meant that, sand was being blown across railroad tracks, across coastal communities, across roads, and it really hindered the ability of people to live in these, 50% of the coastal area that had these immense dunes on them. And so as a result of that, a decision was made to stabilize that sand using non-native beach grasses. So planting non-native beach grasses, just as you would plant your garden, they went out and systematically planted rows and rows and rows of beach grasses. And this happened in the early 1900s, all along the Pacific coast down into California, including California. And that stabilization resulted in the production of foredunes, or these hills of sand that are, behind the beach that we all know about today and all see today. Those did not exist prior to the 1900s, early 1900s. And this is a photograph of a homeowner out on the beach in 1940 with his beach grasses. You can see he's planted a bunch of beach grasses on his beach, or at the back beach part of his property. So there's, been basically a century of beach grass introductions. So the first beach grasses that were planted in the early 1900s were the European beach grass species. So Ammophila arenaria is the scientific name for that grass. And it was widely planted, from San Francisco up into Oregon and Washington. And then by the 1950s, that species had basically either been planted or colonized on its own from all along the Pacific coast, from Mexico up into Canada. And the map that I'm showing here has the locations of where we find European beach grass, or Ammophila arenaria, in red. And this is a recent map, so it shows how far it's spread, and it's actually spread up into Alaska. And then the American beach grass, which is a different species, it's actually native to the east coast of the US. Its scientific name is Ammophila breviligulata, and it was introduced as well into Northern Oregon, so near the Columbia River, in 1935. And so basically we have two different species of beach grasses that were planted here. Both of them are non-native to the Pacific coast. By the 1980s, actually, Ammophila breviligulata, so the second species, dominated all the way, most of northern Oregon, all the way up into Washington, and actually up into Vancouver Island. So it's the dominant species now in that area, with the European beach grass being dominant from kind of central Oregon down into California. So two different species, but the same kind of landscape transformation occurred. This is just a photograph of a book by William Cooper from 1958, who surveyed all the beaches and dunes in Oregon and Washington. And there are a number of photos in this book, as well as maps of what the topography was like back then. And you can see that there was a lot of open sand, and there were kind of small, if you look at that photo in the middle, kind of hummocky dunes, but not the kind of linear foredunes that we see today. And here's some other comparisons. On the left, that's Pacific City in 1930. You can see lots of open sand, very, gray, white environment. And then by 2012, you can see that Pacific City has, a linear foredune that's highly vegetated, and also highly developed community. So the community was able to developed that area in large part because of the planting of beach grasses and that coastal protection and stability that the beach grasses provided. On the right, there's a picture, aerial photo of Umpqua Dunes, which is in southern Oregon, in 1953. You can barely see any vegetation on the shoreline there. And then by today's standards, so when this aerial photograph was taken, you can see that there's lots and lots of vegetation now. And there's actually a foredune, and then behind that foredune, there is basically a forested area that's living on top of the sand or the dune sheet. So big transformations. And that's had consequences, obviously, for our coast. Um, the vegetated dunes have captured and stabilized sand. They also serve as barriers from extreme storms, from sea level rise, from tsunamis, potentially. And then they've also prevented beach erosion. So compared to hard structures, riprap, and that sort of thing, um, dunes are soft barriers, and so they can evolve with the system. They, promote beach um, widening and stabilization, and so that all, leads to healthy beaches and beach recreation. But there are trade-offs, and the trade-offs are some of the things that I've kind of discussed. One is that they've allowed development in what we would think of as kind of historically hazardous coastal areas. So, think about Pacific City or other communities that now live behind those dunes. They've also caused the decline of native species that I showed earlier, including the western snowy plover, which is a federally listed endangered species. Um, they've increased the invasion of non-native species, so things like Scotch broom and gorse are now a lot more prevalent on dunes than they would have been without the foredune present. And then they interfere with coastal viewshed. So people that are living behind those dunes, sometimes the dune builds so high that they actually lose their view. Or, they might interfere with what you think of as kind of nature-based aesthetics because, the beach grass is an invasive species. So what about the present? So we live now in an age of beach grasses and in an age of kind of dune transformation here on the Pacific coast. What does that mean? Well, so we've tried to basically our goals is to try to understand how dunes are built and what determines their shape. And how do these grasses actually build these dunes, and can we predict what dune heights and dune shapes would be in the future? Um, and so this slide just shows kind of a cartoon from a paper that I recently wrote with a number of co-authors looking at basically what are the mechanisms, how do actually the beach grasses capture sand and how do they build dunes? And so we've looked at that quite a bit here in the Pacific coast. And to do that, to try to understand how dunes are built, we've taken a number of different approaches. We've collected observational data. We've set up experiments where we've manipulated grasses and sand. And we've also used models to try to project or predict dune shape and thus some of the coastal protective abilities of dunes and beaches. So we've looked at this from both kind of at a regional scale, so looking at dunes, collecting data on topography and sand supply on dunes all along the Washington and Oregon coast. We've also looked at this at a local scale. So we've set up experiments on beaches where dunes have been knocked down, and created different planting scenarios to try to look at, do different species of grasses build different kinds of dunes. We've also looked at the whole plant scale. So we've looked at how do beach grasses grow, what happens when sand gets deposited on them, and also how do they interact with each other? How do the two different species interact with each other? Because they do co-occur on our coastline. And then we've done very, very specific, kind of at the scale of the stem of a beach grass, wind tunnel experiments where we send wind across a plot of grass and look at how much sand is captured by those grasses. And then we can take all those data and we can put them into these numerically driven models to try to understand the processes that are important in dune building. And so in terms of the kind of regional control of dune shape, one of the findings that we've discovered is that the best predictor of dune shape, and this kind of makes sense, is actually sand supply. So how much sand is being delivered to the beach, and then that sand is being picked up by the wind and delivered back to the dune. That amount of sand is really important in determining the height or the shape or the width of a dune. And it explains about 50% of the variability in our statistical models. And then the beach grass density, so the grasses themselves, the vegetation, explains about 10% of that variability. So how dense that grass is can matter in terms of the height of the dune, or whether or not it's wider or shorter. But only about 10% of that variation is actually explained by the vegetation. That's not to say that vegetation isn't important, because without the vegetation, we would not have the foredunes that we have today. So it's a really important interaction that happens between both the sand supply, how much sand is on the beach, and also vegetation. One of the other things that we discovered kind of early on is that the European beach grass, so that one that occurs from kind of Central Oregon down into California, that species is associated with taller dunes and narrower dunes. So it tends to produce taller and narrow dunes compared to the American beach grass, which is the native on the East Coast. That species tends to produce shorter and wider dunes. And so there's this association that we've measured in the field, and we've actually done experiments as well to look at it in more detail. But one of the explanations is that actually the two beach grasses have different modes of growing. So the European beach grass tends to grow upward, so vertically, and it also has kind of thinner blades, and it's very bunched, compared to the American beach grass, which is more sparsely distributed, has thicker blades and stems, but also grows better horizontally. And so those different growth forms actually produce these different dune shapes. So we, really got into this idea about, do differences in dune grass species actually affect the morphology of dune shape? And because we know that there's a wide variety of different grass species out there, and they have different growth forms and different morphologies. So I'm showing some species here from our coast, so Ammophila arenaria and breviligulata, and Lamus mollis, the native grass. But I'm also showing some species from the East Coast that are really important dune builders out there on that coast. So we've, explored this, what we call kind of a species specific effect of these different grasses on dune shape through both for-dune planting experiments, through these whole plant scale experiments where we create monocultures or polycultures of these different grasses in bags with sand in them, and look at their species interactions, and also look at what happens when we dump a bunch of sand on top of them and they get buried. How do they respond? How do they respond to that kind of sand inundation? And then also these wind tunnel experiments that I talked about earlier. So we've used all these experiments to try to look at the species specific effect. And then we've used those data that we've collected in different numerical models. And what I'm showing here is one of the models that we used. It's called Aeolus. And basically what this model does is simulate the capturing of sand by the grasses. And we can determine the different morphologies of the grasses, feed that into the model, and then look at the output, which would be, different model runs of the elevation of the dunes. And what this graph actually shows on the right is that Ammophila arenaria in this model simulation produces a taller and narrower dune compared to Ammophila breviligulata, which produces a shorter and wider dune. Compared to Lamus mollis, which is our native grass, it produces a dune that's like a tenth of the height of those other two grass species. So very, very short little dune compared to the two beach grass species, the non-native beach grass species. So this model confirmed our data from the field, suggesting that these different species actually create different types of dunes. And this slide shows kind of a gradient of different grass morphology and growth forms from Ammophila arenaria on the left all the way to our native Lamus mollis on the right. And so the gradient takes into account the density of the grasses and their growth form. And it's just to say that, Ammophila arenaria, so the grasses that are more densely packed and growing more vertically produce taller dunes compared to the grasses that grow more sparsely and kind of vertically, or excuse me, horizontally. They produce kind of shorter but wider dunes. So the other thing that we're really interested in is, so given a certain dune shape, height, what does that mean in terms of coastal erosion and flooding? So you can see this picture on the right of a house being completely flood eroded, and almost, basically the dune, it's built on top of a dune, is being overtopped by this high wave event. And so to look at this, we can either wait around for a storm to happen and look at where flooding occurs, or we can use models to try to predict whether flooding will occur and erosion will occur in certain areas of the coast based on the height of the dune and the topography of the beach and the shoreline. And so this work, a lot of this modeling work is done by Peter Ruggiero, who's the geomorphologist that I mentioned earlier. And what they do is they do topographic surveys of all the dunes along the coast, and then come up with sea level and climate change or wave climate scenarios, and use those scenarios in these wave impact models. And that's what's kind of shown on the right there, is a wave impact model schematic. And those wave impact models, they, basically what we do in the model is force a wave on shore onto the beach, and given a certain beach slope and width, that wave will swash up on top of the beach, and depending on the height of the dune, potentially overtop the dune or erode at the base of the dune, erode the base of the dune from, given those conditions, given those wave run-up conditions. And so what Peter then produces from these models are coastal hazard metrics. So we can think about the metrics in terms of like safe beach recreation hours. So does the wave actually wash up to such an extent that the beach isn't safe anymore? So how many hours of that happen? How many hours of that can happen given certain conditions? They also produce this metric called erosion hours, which gives you an idea of how many hours of erosion are going to happen on that beach to that dune. And then overtopping hours, which is, basically how many hours might that dune actually be overtopped and breached, and flood the community or the natural area. So when the models basically show that beach width and dune height are the most critical factors in terms of reducing coastal hazard exposure. So you can, short of producing a tsunami, basically dune height and beach width are the most important factors in determining whether or not you're going to experience erosion in these areas. So all that says to me is that dunes and the beach grasses that are involved in building dunes are very critical in thinking about coastal hazards and our exposure to them. Okay, so what about the future? What does the future hold for our dunes? And what I want to focus on is biodiversity, carbon storage, and a new invader. So as I said earlier, we have these native dune communities. They are very different than they were previous to the beachgrass invasions. We know that. We're not sure exactly how different they were, but we definitely know that many species were dependent on open sand conditions. And so we want to try to recreate those conditions to restore native dune communities. And most of the restoration efforts have been focused on the western snowy plover, given that it's federally listed. And so a lot of the efforts that we know about today have been focused on that particular species, but in doing so have also opened up habitat for native plants and other native insects and other native birds as well. So what Oregon and Washington have done is create these habitat restoration areas. So there are a number of them in Southern Oregon, I think like 7 or 8 of them, and they're increasing yearly. And what happens is that the agencies go out and bulldoze down the foredune, bury the grasses, try to kill the grasses, and basically open up that foredune area or that back dune area for native species, for the plovers, and so forth. So there are a number of HRAs in Southern Oregon. There's a new one in Nehalem. So I think that one's about 5 years old on Nehalem Spit. And then there's another HRA up at Ledbetter Point in Washington. And all of these areas are, being used to hopefully recover the western snowy plover, but then also to start looking at native plant recovery. And so we've done some research surveying all these areas to look at native plant recovery, but also plover recovery. So what happens when you create one of these HRAs? Does it actually recover plovers? And what about native plants? And also, what happens to the coastal protective properties that the foredune was providing previous to it being bulldozed? And so what these graphs show is as you decrease the amount of beach grass, so beach grass percent cover goes down, plover productivity goes up. And so in all these HRAs, plover productivity skyrockets when you take away beach grasses and you take away the dune itself. But in particular, decreasing the beach grass cover is really critical to this. The other thing that happens is that pink sand verbena, which is a graph on the bottom, very bottom, it also increases. And pink sand verbena is a critically endangered dune plant that is, it's very hard to recover, but it's showing signs of recovery given the decreasing beach grass cover. Endemic native plant species richness, unfortunately, has not increased very much, at least since we published, or at least when we published this paper, and that was in 2019. So it was a while ago, but the endemic plants are not recovering to the extent that we would like to see, and probably that's due to just seed dispersal issues, not having enough, not having a seed bank anymore to help with the recruitment of those native plants. But the other thing that happens is that the risk of flooding and foredune erosion also increases. So we use those models that I talked about earlier to model what would happen if you knocked down the dune, or the dune was shorter than it was previous to the restoration. And definitely flooding risk and foredune erosion increase a lot with these restoration projects. And so the good news about this is that all these restoration projects are set up in areas where humans are not exposed to coastal hazards. So we're not, creating a conflict between coastal hazards and restoration. We've also studied the consequences of these dunes for carbon storage, because we're all interested in, decreasing CO2 in the environment. And one way to do that is for plants to take in carbon, right, and store it in the soil, and in their biomass themselves. And so very few people have actually measured the carbon storage ability of dunes. There's been a lot of work in salt marshes and estuaries, and even in like kelp forests and things like that. But in dunes, there's been very little work. And so we took on this project about, I don't know, 5 years ago, to measure the carbon storage in dunes, both in the sand, but also in the plants themselves. So we went out and cored through the dune and extruded the cores and measured the carbon that's in the sand, as well as in the plants and the roots. And so this graph shows how much carbon storage is occurring at a whole bunch of sites, from Grayland Plains up in Washington all the way down to Umpqua Dunes in Oregon. And this is the tons of carbon that's stored per meter section of dune, a longshore section of dune. And one of the things that you can see is that Clatsop Plains has the most carbon storage. So and also it has the largest dune volume of any place on the coast. So it makes sense that it is actually storing the largest amount of carbon. Nehalem Bay, so where the HRA is that I mentioned earlier, that also Nehalem Spit has a lot of carbon stored there. But for the most part, all the other dunes have pretty similar carbon storage ability. But to give you an idea of how much carbon that really is, turns out that our dunes store 2 to 3 times more carbon than dunes on the Atlantic coast. So we have very productive dunes, very productive grasses here, and a lot of carbon that's been kind of sequestered in all of that sand that is accumulated in those 4 dunes. Okay, so I want to just finally end with a new emerging player in the beachgrass sphere, and that's the discovery of a beachgrass hybrid species, so a new species of beachgrass that was formed through the reproduction of the European beachgrass species with the American beachgrass species. So Ammophila arenaria hybridized with Ammophila breviligulata and formed a new hybrid species that has characteristics that are in some cases above and beyond its parents, and in some cases kind of intermediate between its parents. And the way we discovered it was that we were I think it was 2012, we were out surveying these grasses and noticed an unusual grass. And you can see down in the right, there's a blade and a stem, and then there's a little tissue that's kind of sticking out from the blade. And that tissue is called a ligule. And that ligule is half the size of Ammophila arenaria ligule, which is on the left. And Ammophila breviligulata has a very, 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 very tiny brevi ligule. And so we started to think, hey, this is kind of weird that we have this ligule that's intermediate between these two species. Maybe this is a hybrid. And the grass itself also looked kind of intermediate in terms of its kind of the stem widths and kind of its robustness. And I put a circle around the grass. You can also see that it's a different color than the grass that's on the right. That grass on the right is kind of pink, has a pinkish stem, and the grass on the left is very like really rosy purple. That's the hybrid. We don't use color to identify it, on a regular basis, although it turns out that especially later in the season, color is actually a pretty good determiner of whether or not it's the hybrid or not. So one of my grad students did the genetic work on the parent species and the hybrid and determined that yes, in fact, the hybrid is a true genetic combination of both of the parent species. It has chromosomes from Ammophila arenaria as well as Ammophila breviligulata. So it is a true hybrid. And in response to that, we created a iNaturalist page and also worked with Oregon Shores to do some training on, so this is a community science project to get people out there looking for the hybrid and helping us identify it. And actually it's been quite successful. We had a lot of people post on iNaturalist that they think they found the hybrid, and then we look at it and try to identify whether or not it is the hybrid or not. But we've done a lot of research on the range and abundance of the hybrid, and so we've basically at this point found at least 500 hybrid individuals. So these are individuals that are distinct from each other. They're genetically distinct. They have their own genotype. Um, and we think and we pretty much know that there are a lot more out there. We haven't been able to find them. um, and so we haven't been able to find, obviously all of them, given that we can't walk the entire coast. But we're hoping that other people can. Um, and where we found them is basically from Ocean Shores, Washington, all the way down to Fort Stevens, Oregon. So within that range where the two species overlap, that's where we're finding the hybrid also. And actually, I should say, yeah, Pacific City is the farthest south that we found it. We've done lots of experiments with it and looked at the hybrid growth and its competitive ability with its parents. And basically what we found is that the hybrid actually grows faster than its parents, about 2 times faster, so twice as fast as its parent species, and it is competitively dominant over its parent species. It also has a different growth form. So I was saying earlier, the European beach grass grows vertically, creates tall and narrow dunes. The American beach grass grows laterally, short and wide dunes. And the hybrid does both. It can grow both laterally and vertically. And we suspect create tall and wide dunes as a result. And to look at that growth, what we done is set up another experiment. This is at Nehalem Spit, where we've planted plots of different beach grass species and then looked at them over time. And so this experiment has been ongoing for almost 5 years now. And we've gone from, having no dune, no foredune, to having a huge, multi-meter foredune as a result of these grasses growing and capturing sand. And the different plots are here. These squiggly lines represent the topography of the dune, so how it's changed over time. If you were to look at it like in cross section, you could see how it's changed over time. And the plot, or the plot that's outlined by red shows Ammophila arenaria, and Ammophila arenaria has created the tallest foredune of all the species. Then the hybrid, so the hybrid is in orange. It's created the second highest dune out there. Breviligulata, Ammophila breviligulata, the American beach grass, has created the third highest dune. And then Lamus mollis, which is our native, is outlined in blue, dark blue. And you can see there's basically almost no foredune that has been created by that species. So we suggest that the hybrid has the potential to spread and dominate over time. And basically, we're hypothesizing that the hybrid will spread widely in the future and it will dominate our dunes over time, that it will outcompete its parents and probably result in taller dunes where American beach grass dominates, and similar sized dunes where the European beach grass dominates. So it's definitely something to watch out for and to think about in terms of, how it's going to shape our dunes in the future. So what are our next steps? So we want to find more hybrid beach grass, and we're interested in studying its population genetics and its ecology so we can better predict its spread and its impact. We also are really interested in studying native dune plant communities and trying to help better to create better techniques to restore these dune areas that we've set aside for restoration. And then we're continuing to seek kind of coastal planning solutions that, optimize coastal protection, so optimize our use of these, for dune habitats, but also the other ecosystem services that we care about. And so it's a fine balance, and it's really a planning um, issue for a lot of our communities here in Oregon and also in Washington. And so, we just hope that our research can help with that planning. And I think I'll end it there. If you have questions or thoughts, I'm happy to entertain them.
Great. Thanks so much, Sally. It looks like we already have one question for you in the Q&A. Stella is wondering, what are the consequences of restoration projects on the carbon storage aspects?
Yeah, great question. So we also cored the HRAs, so the restoration areas, and there's not any carbon in those areas. So um, it turns out that the most recent HRAs, the most recent HRA is in Nehalem, and there's some carbon still in that sand or in that sort of restoration area that's been buried because, when they bulldozed the dune, they buried the grasses. So there's a legacy of carbon there, but the carbon is a lot lower. The amount of carbon is a lot lower than it is in a unrestored dune. And there are areas like Ledbetter where we surveyed, and also down in Bandon, where the HRAs have existed for 20 or 30 years. The carbon is non-existent. So there is a trade-off there in terms of thinking about carbon storage, if that's something that you care about.
Great. Thanks for that. And thanks for that question, Stella. I have a question. We'll see if any other pop in the chat or in the Q&A, but until then, I was wondering, what are the carbon storage capacities compared to other coastal ecosystems like estuaries?
Yeah, great question. So um, it's packaged differently. So if you think about a marsh, all the roots and rhizomes and the sediment, that's where all the carbon is, right? So it's stored in the sediment, but also in the roots and rhizomes of the plants themselves. And then it can kind of be deeply stored in the sediment below where the roots and rhizomes are kind of dominant. Um, Marshes aren't very deep, so the sediment isn't very deep, and then you get into areas that don't have any carbon in them anymore. It's mostly just sediment, like very low carbon sediment. But when you do, when you core a marsh, you're going to get really, really, really high carbon values just because of all that concentration of carbon at the surface. With dunes, it's kind of, if you think about it, it's sort of, a little bit opposite in that there's roots and rhizomes that go all the way down to the water table. So you could have a rhizome that's, 18 feet tall in a dune. So there's going to be carbon storage all the way down to wherever the roots and rhizomes stop. So there's just a larger volume of sand that can store, arguably what is a lower amount of carbon, but there's a larger volume there to store it in. So that's all to say that the storage is not as great per volume as it would be for a marsh, but it's still pretty high if you consider that we have a lot of dune habitat, especially compared to like a wetland or an estuary or a salt marsh. The coastal, like sandy beaches, make up something like a third of the world's coastline. So it's a really extensive ecosystem compared to wetlands.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like we have a couple of questions in the chat. The first two have to deal with prescribed burns or
Mm.
fires. Anna says, could control burns help kill off invasive grasses? And then Aaron says, what role do you see prescribed fire playing in ecosystem restoration in coastal dunes, impacts on carbon storage, trade-offs between carbon storage, biodiversity, native species, and coastal protection? USFS burns at coastal dunes in Siuslaw National Forest. Oregon Military Department burns at Camp Relaya or Clatsop
Mhm.
Plains, and Washington state parks all have prescribed fire activities in coastal dunes, along with other treatments.
Yeah. So, I think the prescribed burns are, if you're doing it to restore habitat for plovers or for native species, um, I think that's one thing. You're not killing the grass. Obviously, it's going to grow back um, the next year. So, I think it's, and the grasses grow faster than the native plants grow. For example, that experiment that we set up at Nehalem, we planted the grasses. Within 5 years, they are 100% cover. They've created dunes that are, you know, 5, 6 feet tall. Um, so it can happen very quickly, and um, grasses, the grasses grow really fast just because of their kind of, rhizome structure. So I guess, I think the fire issue, sort of depends on why you're doing prescribed burns. If you're trying to restore habitat for native species, I think it might not work very well. Might take a while for that to kill the grasses. I mean, I think and then, again, you still have the fording structure, which can impede plovers. I mean, they can live in the back dune habitat, but they have to, traverse this like massive hill of sand to get back there. So um, I think the restoration techniques that involve bulldozing are probably the most successful. Although then again, you have this trade-off with the coastal protection piece. I know there are cases where people have created corridors through dunes for plovers to access the back of the dune. Um, and so that's kind of one strategy to, you know, help plovers find more breeding habitat, um, and also kind of keep the coastal protection ability of that area.
Great, thanks for that. And thanks
A
to
lot of,
and
you know,
Aaron questions.
yeah, a lot of complexity in the kind of trade-offs. It's like a very, very complex trade-off situation. I mean, as all of our coastal kind of habitat development issues are involve trade-offs. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I also just want to mention if anyone wants to come off mute to ask your question, just raise your hand or put it in the chat, and we'd be happy to let you speak. Don't mean to silence you all. Um, but we also have a question from Natalie. For coastal erosion, are native plants less effective at preventing erosion than the three beach grasses?
Mm. Uh, there's, I would say yes, although um, there have been very few studies on that, looking at the effects of, for example, plant rhizomes and roots in keeping, sort of retaining sand when erosion occurs. I mean, if erosion is, if we have a big coastal storm, no plant is going to be able to resist that kind of erosion. And, if you've ever walked along a beach with a dune where there's been erosion, you can see like all the roots and rhizomes kind of hanging down from the base of the dune or at the what we call the toe of the dune. And so they're just kind of dangling there. They're not able to, really um, control the loss of sand. But then in the summer, when, winds pick up and sand is becoming more mobile from the beach, blows back into the toe, those roots get buried again and the plants are growing again. So, that kind of cycle, I think, works really well with beach grasses. And so that's one of the reasons why they easily recover from erosive events. And I think, even though we don't have a lot of evidence for this, I think native plants can also do that. I mean, the native plants that are living in dunes also have extensive rhizome systems and, adaptations to living in a very erosive and kind of sand, dynamic sand environment. Um, but, I think the beach grasses are just, they have these adaptations that allow them to really kind of serve, um, to create dunes and to kind of reduce erosion better than a lot of other plants. And, to think about, if you think about it, like these plants are native in other places, right? So they're native in Europe and they're native in the East Coast. And they do really well at stabilizing those systems. So, that's the reason why they were introduced to our region.
I have a question for you, Sally.
Mhm.
So you said that 50% of dune shape variability is due to sand supply from the beach or like how much sand is on the beach.
Mhm.
Do you do any modeling or can you make any predictions about how dunes will be affected by increased shoreline armoring, or do you factor in hardening of shorelines into any of your modeling?
Um, so Peter has done, Peter Ruggiero is the person who's done most of this modeling. I think what, what people have looked at in the past with armoring is the loss of beach. So the width of the beach decreases through time, and trying to understand, you know, how much beach loss you'll have given a certain amount of armoring. Um, on the flip side, uh, you know, obviously dunes are better at capturing sand. They're also better at releasing sand from erosion. So they're the interaction between the dune itself and the beach is very dynamic and allows, keeps the beach from eroding basically, as long as there's, a static sand supply from the ocean. Um, so, those kind of models people have done. They've looked at, how that dynamic actually works. Um, and it's one of the benefits from having kind of a soft um, system or soft back beach, barrier. i.e. a dune, versus something that's like a riprap. I don't know if that answered your question, but
Yeah, thanks.
yeah, so that, a lot of the models, what they look at is, you know, what's the sand delivery, and then how does that sand delivery influence dune height?
Mhm.
So traversing, you know, sand coming in from the shoreline to the beach and then blowing up onto the dune and kind of modeling that whole interaction, how that works. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, so if you affect
Yeah,
one part of it, it's gonna kind of affect the entire dynamic system.
exactly. Yeah. And there are people in Europe, especially that in the Netherlands, who do a lot of this modeling because they um, really, really depend on their dunes to protect them from sea level rise and flooding. Um, but we also have folks here in the US that do a lot of that modeling. Yeah, it's kind of, it's a really, really active area of research, especially now,
Yeah,
given, sea level rise and given extreme storms and stuff like that. Yeah.
yeah, good to know. Well, while we wait for any last questions to trickle in, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us. We will send out a recording of this via email, and we will also be posting it on our respective YouTube channels if you want to share it with your friends or watch it again. And then I just wanted to make a quick plug for our upcoming webinars. On October 14th, we will welcome Haley Bond to talk about dynamic cobble berm revetments. And then on November 5th, we will welcome Steve Dundas to talk about the economic valuation of beach recreation and riprap and ecosystem services that we get from beaches and dunes. So join us for those. Those are the next ones in this Oregon Beaches Forever webinar series. And if we don't have any more questions, I think will close it out.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
have a
thanks
good night,
everyone,
Sally.
and have a good night.
Thanks all. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks, Sally. Thanks,
Yep.
Kaya. Have a good night, all.